I can tell you what I think, but if these principles are right, then you could apply them yourself to whatever time or circumstances exist. So I broke it down in terms of economic principles and investment principles because the markets follow the economy. So in order to understand economics and all the markets, you have to understand, in order to understand the market, you have to understand the economy. So I want to describe how I think the economy works. I think it's like it's a perpetual motion machine. And there are four big forces, three important equilibriums and two levers. If you get this down, I think this basically, everything through my eyes is along those lines. Over a period of time, we raise our living standards because we learn how to do things better. We become more efficient. That's called productivity, output per man hour. And that is something that evolves over a period of time. That is because it evolves. It is not something that is a big thing that we see as a big thing. The big things that we see and feel every day are debt cycles. Now, there's a short-term debt cycle and there's a long-term debt cycle. When I say a short-term debt cycle, what I mean is what we think of as normally the business cycle, right? You have a recession, you have a weakness in the economy. When the rate of economic activity is too low, then central banks produce credit. And credit is buying power. Produce that credit, it makes purchases of goods, services, and financial assets happen. And so the economy picks up. That cycle usually lasts 7 to 10 years. As the economy picks up, the demand rises relative to the capacity. As you get later in the cycle, the central bank puts the brakes on it. They raise interest rates, tighten monetary policy. As there's less slack in the economy, the unemployment rate is low, they put the brakes on it, interest rates go up, tightness of monetary policy, then you have a recession, slow up, and that's the cycle, right? And because credit is buying power, by providing it, it also produces debt, and debt means the obligation to pay back, and so by its very nature, it's cyclical. First comes the stimulation, then comes the paying back, which means when you produce credit, you can spend more than you earn, and when you pay back, you have to spend less than you earn, and that's the nature of the cycle. And I think we're all acquainted with that type of cycle. And with that cycle goes market cycles, which we'll talk about. That's what I mean by the short-term debt cycle. There's also a long-term debt cycle, which is the accumulation of all of those shorter-term debt cycles. Everybody wants things to go up. They want their asset prices, the markets to go up. They want employment to go up. They want everything to go up. And for that reason, central banks, over a period of time, stimulate, and they do that by normally lowering interest rates until interest rates hit zero. And then when interest rates hit zero, they can't do that anymore. And then we come to the need to print money and buy financial assets, which we call quantitative easing. And when they can't do that anymore, or there are limitations, we come to the end of the long-term debt cycle. So there's a short-term debt cycle, a long-term debt cycle, and productivity. Now, related to all that is politics. There was a debt crisis and interest rates hit zero. And in both of those cases, there was the printing of money and the buying of financial assets, which caused those financial asset prices to go up and more liquidity in the economy. And that particularly benefited those who had financial assets. And it contributed to the wealth gap and the income gap, as did technology. And as a result of that, in the 1930s, as also happened now, politics entered into the picture. As we're seeing in the world right now, that issue of wealth gap is causing populism of the left and populism of the right, and that's having an effect on the markets and having an effect on the economy. So we are also seeing a situation, very much like the 30s, in which we're seeing a rising power challenging an existing power. That's a geopolitical cycle. Determines how money flows through the economy. And a normal condition is, for reasons I won't digress into, to have cash have a lower return than bonds that have to have a lower return from equities, having to do with how the system works. Basically, central banks put cash on deposit, and people with better ideas have to make a profit to that. They use that money to create these other the level of economic activity and have to have higher returns. And when that's not the case, the way they tighten it is that there are two levers. So now there are two levers: monetary policy and fiscal policy, right? Monetary policy then is the means by which the brakes and the gas are put on, and the brakes and the gas being put on become reflected in each of these other items. So let's say if debt growth is too high relative to income growth and capacity utilization is high and stretched, monetary policy will be tightened. And that tightening of monetary policy will change the projected return of cash relative to bonds and of equities, those risk premiums. And that will slow the economy down, and that will drive those cycles. And that's how the economy is operating in these perpetual motion kind of way. You could almost picture, I literally can picture, where you are in those cycles and what is happening, and you can anticipate what is going to happen next from that, because it's that perpetual motion machine. So that's my template in a nutshell. And if you keep thinking, like, where are we now? Then you can kind of think where we are. A big inevitable force that happens over a period of time, even the biggest economic turbulence, looks like a bump in that cycle, right? Productivity is a big force. Betting on productivity is a big force. But what happens is that cycle, as you get later in the long-term debt cycle, that productivity begins to slow because there needs to be investment and there needs to be other things. And when when there's prosperity and so on, you get more productivity. It's a self-reinforcing cycle.